The waves or the tide, which is more important? As a metaphor, the sea represents both our consciousness and our unconsciousness. We can cry tears of delight or get our ducks in a row. All these expressions are linked to our emotions, the water of life, and the subject of today's podcast. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13 sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior and the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the new moon in Cancer, her conjunction with Vulcanus, opposition to Pluto, and square to Chiron. We will also spotlight and interpret the dual trines involving Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There's a lot going on, so let's jump in. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
Well, as I said in that little spiel at the beginning, it seems like there's a lot going on. So, what would you like to introduce us with today? What is the summary overview as such?
The beginning of wisdom is to know thyself, one of my most favorite expressions and very appropriate for today's podcast. What that expression implies and requires is introspection, a willingness to look inward and to go within. The water metaphors for emotions are many and varied. We can deal with a trickle of emotions, waves of emotions. We can experience waterfalls of emotions. Emotions can be destructive or supportive. They can be deep and mysterious. They can manifest as drives and compulsions, and they can be surface and fleeting. Emotionally, they can be disruptive and challenging for us. Emotions can also lead to liberation and release. Expressions like water under the bridge, blood is thicker than water, still waters run deep, test the waters, make waves, or dead in the water, they're all expressions and metaphors for emotion. The moon conjunct fiery Vulcanus speaks to trapped and unresolved emotions, those blind spots that we all have. The Chiron square in this context relates to existential issues around birth and separation anxiety, the umbilicus experience that we all go through as infants, and we'll talk about that. The Greek word for umbilicus is omphalos, which means origin or root of existence, or the center of our world. And absolutely we will touch on, we've talked about Chiron before, but we'll touch on that again today because he's in a square to this new moon. The presence of Saturn is, as it usually is about lessons and insights that we can gain from, in this case, the wisdom that we gain from pain and from resolving that pain, how we reconcile our emotions, how we rehabilitate our attitudes, how we can change our experience when we go through those Saturnian processes of applying mastery and wisdom to our emotions, to our trauma, to our pain. The Neptune energies here caution us when we're dealing with emotions about avoidance behaviors, about escapism, about narcissism, about playing that victim and getting into that mindset. When we are overtaken or consumed by fear, when we are terrorized sometimes by our emotions, that can all lead to the shadow side of Neptune, can manifest in our lives as a lack of courage, a profound disempowerment, and a disconnection with self. In psychology, they call that escapism, that that avoidance of our emotions, particularly deep emotions, troubling emotions, trapped emotions, they call that dissociation. And this is a Neptunian shadow frequency. This is where the dramas in our lives, we externalize them in order to see our pain in others and therefore shift the blame. We look for a savior, for a salve, for an analgesic, literally and figuratively sometimes to avoid reality, usually to suppress our emotions, those difficult emotions. Pluto also plays a role in this new moon, and we've talked many times about the Plutonic path, but we'll recap it again today. Pluto's role here is to help us when we're dealing with emotions, i.e. the moon, and the moon trine Neptune particularly and opposite to Pluto's. There's a lot of water here. Pluto's role is to help us transmute negative energies by cultivating awareness, and that's the key. It's to help us transcend self-limiting beliefs that underpin emotions through the process of reframing, and to transform the situations and scenarios that we find ourselves in emotionally through action being the key word. The Platonic pathway is therefore a process of liberation, release, and consciousness expansion and growth ultimately. So, this podcast today is a practical and purposeful discussion about the new moon in Cancer. And it's useful and applicable to our day-to-day experiences as humans. And it will help us, hopefully, be the change that we want to see in the world.
Yeah, I love that. I thank you for bringing that up. It's so important to really go inwards and think about, did I have to react that way, or did I have to judge that person? So really going inwards and being that change that you want to see in the world. If you don't want people judging you, then perhaps start with you not judging others and see how that feels instead of doing it that way. So this new moon occurs on the 25th of July here in New Zealand at 7:11 in the morning. The sun moon are conjunct at 3 degrees in Cancer. Vulcanus is just a couple of degrees sitting at 5 degrees Cancer. On the other side, we have Pluto at 2 degrees Capricorn. Neptune and Saturn are at 9 and 10 degrees in Pisces, and Chiron sits at 35 degrees Pisces. So, where would you like to take us on this journey now?
Just as you pointed out there are so many astrological archetypes in play. So, given the prominence of water, though, we're going to focus on emotions. Now, emotions, and this bit I'm going to read, but the rest of it will just free flow with. Emotions originate from complex interactions within the brain, specifically the limbic system, and involve both biological and cognitive processes. The brain, especially structures like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex, play a central role in generating and regulating emotional responses. These responses are shaped by how we interpret and react to events, influenced by past experiences and cultural context. These neurotransmitters and hormones that play a role in mediating our emotional responses. For example, dopamine is associated with reward and pleasure, while oxytocin is linked to bonding and attachment. So, how we interpret and appraise situations that influence our emotional experiences obviously completely individual. But our thoughts and our memories and our expectations absolutely shape our emotional responses. The moon is intimately tied to our emotions. Emotions are not simply triggered by external events, but rather they arise from a complex interplay between our biological and cognitive faculties. You know, things like our left brain, right brain, we've all heard that expression, our head and heart and the flow of energies, and sometimes they can be going in different directions. Therefore, our emotions fluctuate, they move, and they're fluid. Emotions can emerge from within us, or alternatively, they can be, or seemingly can be, triggered by an external stimuli. They can be catalyzed or activated, if you like, by what we hear, what we see, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell. These are the pathways that can elicit a physiological response within us. Emotions that are foreign to us or that we don't like, or we are uncomfortable with the way we're responding emotionally, typically humans, an immediate reaction in that situation is to suppress, to ignore, to dismiss, rather than embrace. And we had an example of that the other day when we were looking at, a TV program, and I laughed out loud, and you recoiled, and I said, we have to remember that that's just acting. Emotions provide signals for us that help us to think about and to examine cognitively that which is going on in our lives, both inwardly and outwardly. Emotions operate, therefore, as a feedback mechanism, and therefore they function best when we embrace our emotions rather than push them away. Those emotions that we don't like may, in fact, point to an underlying belief that we have adopted or absorbed unconsciously or unwillingly in our childhood, something that we have to be very careful with and cognizant of with around your kids. Emotions, therefore, can be learned responses, they can be practiced and refined, and we engage with our emotions or they manifest as either a behavior to avoid pain or seek pleasure. Yet, when we respond along that paradigm of pain and pleasure, emotional pain and pleasure, that is, we're moving in one direction or the other predominantly, when we do this repetitively, we can entrain ourselves to bad habits or ineffective behavior that ultimately limits our experience. It puts a ceiling on our expansion. It constrains and restrains us. So emotions can work in that way. We all know about the fight or flight response. You see a snake, your amygdala might quickly trigger a fear response, sending signals to our bodies to prepare to fight or flight. Yet, if we realize that the snake is harmless, i.e., it was just a rubber snake that the kids were playing with, for example, our cognitive reappraisal of that situation can override the initial fear response, and our body will actually calm down. So that ability to distinguish between what we think is real and what we think is perceived as real is really important when it comes to dealing with our emotions. Most people know about the fight or flight response, but I like to look at that. There's always a third response, and that's one of delight. So there's fight, there's flight, and there's delight. Each of those emotions evoke a different response in us, a physiological response. Delight, for example, means to be present to the emotion, to revel and dwell in the uplifting feeling that it's generating for us. Vulcanus, in the astrological context here, in a tight conjunction with the new moon, suggests that for some we may be dealing with deep, trapped, or uncomfortable emotions. The key then for those people that are in that situation is to wrestle with those emotions, to confront them consciously, and ultimately to come to understand them. This process, however, requires really honest self-appraisal, profound self-honesty, and a willingness to make change. Excuse me. The Vedics, and I've talked about this before, they talk about the four states of mind, one of which is called the manas, the M-A-N-A-S. That is the repository of memory, which can be either in our physical body, i.e. the mind-body relationship, or that manas can exist in our subconscious, which is a reflection of the moon, of course, which ultimately links to the quantum realms, the parallel realities, the metaphysical realms that exist beyond time and space, which means that sometimes our emotions can float into our awareness from seemingly nowhere. Understanding that cognitively allows us to be less critical and to sometimes just let things go. One of the things that I do when I'm dealing with emotions, and you've heard me say this as well, Sana, is that I look at the intensity of the emotion And I ask myself, this is this cognitive engagement with my emotions. I ask myself quietly, how persistent is that emotion? And how persistent are those memories? And to what extent do I feel them in my body? We know that for most people, they will feel their emotions very strongly in their stomach. They call that the second brain. But emotions can also be felt in the neck and tension in other parts of the body as well. So that intensity of emotions is part of the signal or the process to decide whether to really engage with the emotion or just to let it go. And I have that expression which you mentioned earlier, is to look at the tides when you're coming dealing with emotions, not to look at the waves. If you've ever stood at a beach when the tide's coming in, sometimes it feels like the waves are actually going in a different direction. But if you look at the underlying current, it's always moving in the same direction, either in or out, despite what the waves are doing. So the waves can represent those turbulent surface emotions, but the underlying emotions are the key. That's what we need to get at when we're dealing with emotional reform and reconfiguration and rehabilitation and so on and so forth. So look at the waves, the tides, which is the underlying and the prevailing direction of the emotion, be that positive or negative. And I ask myself, if I'm dealing with devilish thoughts, or bad dreams, for example, I ask myself, how persistent or consistent is that manifesting in my life? Is it once in a blue moon? If it is, I'm not too concerned about it. But if these devilish thoughts, debilitating thoughts, or dark thoughts, or emotions ultimately, are regular and consistent, that's a signal for us to go inward and to look to unearth and resolve the drivers of that. And that's what that Vulcan energy and the Pluto energy opposite is actually all about.
And there's so many different ways, right, to deal with those trapped emotions as such. We talk about the trapped emotions quite often, and I feel like maybe we as a society don't talk about our emotions enough. What does our state of being, how does that influence not just our physical body, but also our surrounding, right? If you're constantly surrounded or with someone who's down in the dumps, um, how do you feel as a bystander to that? Do you feel good? Do you want to spend time with them? Perhaps if they are one of your loved ones or your child. But I do it with my daughter, like when she's got this dark cloud around her, I let her stew for a little bit, but then I'm like, hold on, let's just take a minute, close your eyes and take a deep breath and think about the beautiful things that are around us. And I'll mention the birds or it's a beautiful blue sky or whatever. And if you believe in God or angels or whatever, you can ask for those beings to wrap you in a blanket of unconditional love. And whenever I do that with her, it changes her whole being and therefore changes the whole atmosphere in the house. If you do have some baggage, then techniques like emotional freedom technique, where you use the tapping or the emotion code, something that I use. But another one that I have used myself because I had a extreme phobia of spiders, which got heightened during pregnancy with all the emotions. There's another technique called EMDR, where a psychologist or a trained person uses rapid eye movement for that emotion to be stored in a different part of the brain. So if this is something that you're struggling with, there's been a traumatic event, it could be a fear of something or something physically happened to you. I highly recommend looking into that to just change where that memory is stored so that you can just look back at that traumatic event in a different way. I've had that done with the spiders, and it actually blew my mind of how effective that is. If some of these tips are helpful for you, please drop them in the comments. We love it when you interact with our content, both on YouTube and Spotify. I love the way that you talk about Chiron, David. There's many astrologists out there who talk about the wounded healer, and talk about Chiron in quite a different way, but the way that you have brought it to my attention with the cut of the umbilicus and the deep hurt that we can be experiencing in this life, and how Chiron is an archetype of that. I love that. So how do you see Chiron playing out? Chiron, of course, is still in Pisces, so a very emotional place for him to be. But now it is square to this new moon. So how does he play a role?
Yeah, anytime there's a square, we've mentioned this before, that is probably, well, there's three particular angles that really activate the kind of the tougher side of these archetypes, and one's a square, the other is an opposition, and the third is a conjunction. So a square is a difficult energy to navigate, especially at a new moon, and especially when it's in Pisces as well. But yeah, as you've described, look, I came to Chiron understanding through a lot of my own shadow work. And I began that process, um, from a very early age, maybe 12, 13, as a son of, well, as the oldest of three boys at that stage, and mum and dad were going through a divorce, which began a lot earlier than that, maybe 9 or 10. I was going through that, but it took me a while for my brain to begin to process that, and in some of those emotions to come to the surface. And in doing so, and in my path towards astrology, I discovered that I had Chiron and Pisces, and I came to an understanding and an interpretation that is based on my experience of dealing with that energy and with that archetype, which is, the wounded healer concept doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So that's how I've arrived at that, just as a background. But as you've touched on, for me, Chiron, it's about separation anxiety. But that isn't always apparent to us. And actually, what does that mean really in this context? When we emerge from the womb, and I've talked about this at length before, so I'll just do the cliff notes, but when we emerge from the womb, and this is an experience that everyone on the planet, all 8 billion plus of us, go through, unless there's an immaculate conception, lol. When we emerge from the womb, we are largely unconscious of what's going on. And when the umbilicus is cut by the surgeons, the doctor, or the midwife, whoever does that, that leaves a imprint of a physiological and metaphysical imprint in our body mind, actually. It imprints on us this concept or idea that we've just been literally cut off from source. And we're not conscious of that. So it's sitting there as an unresolved issue, and that's why it's often called an existential crisis, a deep primal crisis that unless we tap into it, we don't even know that it's there. But how does it come to the surface? Well, that's the interesting part. Whenever, and most of us go through this, and you'd be unlikely to go through an entire life without this being triggered in one way or another. But it comes to the surface, this sense of being cut off from source. It comes to the surface when we have to confront an existential crisis that involves overwhelming emotions. We're typically swamped, uh, and that can be triggered by, say, loss of a really important relationship, loss of a partner or a brother or a twin or mother or father or whatever, or even the loss of a pet, right? Um, Death, divorce, dramatic events that really upset our world when we start to engage with this idea of there's a separation that begins to emerge in us, and a feeling that we feel abandoned, and we begin to go through almost instinctively a process of saying this feels unfair. We feel that there is sometimes, and this can manifest on both an individual and a collective level, and we see it collectively everywhere. But we feel that when we're dealing with these overwhelming, difficult to digest emotional situations, often we lash out. That's unfair. There is no God. There is no meaning. And it's interesting that Christ on the cross, one of the most famous sayings is, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? And this is an expression of that deep primal fear of abandonment, of alienation, of being utterly alone. And what that triggers, the emotional pathway to trigger that, so it resides in us because of this umbilicus cutting process, and then it's sitting there and it may be activated. They call that a complex in psychology. But the key is that when it comes to the surface and we begin to lash out and blame and say, oh, woe is me, and so on and so forth, is to recognize, and I know it's difficult, but sometimes this can take time to do this, but we need to recognize and articulate to ourselves that that is not real. We have not been cut off from source. And source in this case being the source of our sustenance, the source of our life force. Of course, we associate that. You talked about that rapid eye movement and moving that neural pathway, moving that experience to a different part of the brain or activating a different pathway. What this umbilicus experience does is it activates a pathway, a neural pathway, which is a memory, right? And it needs to have this fuel of this emotion to bring it forward. So when we're going through that, we have to say to ourselves, I'm not cut off from the source of my life. I'm not cut off at all. It's a ghost and it must be overcome with the key word being consciousness. The way that we do that is that we have to reconnect with our heart space. We need to get our feet in the ground. We need to reconnect, firstly, on a physical level with Mother Earth, and also on a spiritual and emotional and level. We need to reconnect with our inner guidance system, with our intuition, with our third eye. And we do that through the practice of meditation and mindfulness.
Take some time out of your busy day. I'm so grateful that we live here in Nelson, New Zealand. We are just a short drive or bike ride away from the beach or the hills, the river, and just taking that time out for you. And it's just as important as doing grocery shopping and making sure that you've got food in the fridge. It's making sure that you've got replenishment in your, I don't know, mindfulness body, your emotional body, your spiritual body, and just re-tap into that. Thank you for that deep dive, but again, into Chiron. The next one that you love talking about, Pluto. So just to make sure that people remember, Pluto is sitting on the other side of this new moon, and Pluto is at 2 degrees Capricorn. If you don't believe us, download an application on your phone and point it to the night sky, find Pluto, and you will see it's at the beginning of Capricorn. It's nowhere near Aquarius. So just check for yourself if you don't believe us. But what do you see Pluto helping us to transform our emotions during this new moon?
Again, for me, this is my experience of Pluto, and Pluto sits directly opposite Chiron. And Chiron for me is in my 10th house, and Pluto's right down there in the 4th house. So it's along that 410 axis, and that's a difficult place for Pluto to be. And we don't have time today to go into where Pluto sits for each of us individually in our specific 13 sign astrological chart. That is the place where we have the biggest opportunity for emotional release. And because of that, I thought Pluto's quite a mysterious energy to deal with. In fact, water signs, full stop, are very multifaceted and nuanced. And in fact, the more you go through, you start with Cancer water, Scorpio water, Pisces water, the more you go through the water complex, the water trilogy, the more interesting it becomes, but the more you have to have tools to be able to navigate through. For the moon, the tool I use is the moon tarot card. And I've talked at length about the massive amounts of symbology that are in there, especially the dog, the wolf, and the crayfish emerging from the waters of consciousness. But when it comes to the Plutonic pathway or that Scorpion energy, but specifically Pluto here, I've got a process that I developed for myself that works when it comes to dealing with deep emotions. Of course, we talk about Pluto as being deep space or deep water as a metaphor, as an analogy. To go to Pluto, to understand the depths of Pluto, you need to be prepared to go to the outer reaches of your experience. And that means, in this case, going into your unconscious. Not sometimes deliberately. Sometimes this can come up, and like I say, um, unless you have plenty of time and energy, you wouldn't be activating the platonic pathway in your life, the platonic energies that I'm going to touch on. But if you are dealing with, i.e., the Vulcanus energy, the deep fears or phobias, the deep traumas, the trapped emotions, any of that really grunty emotional stuff, with Pluto's presence here, it gives a very practical path, and that's why we call it the Plutonic pathway, which involves 3 steps. The first thing to do when dealing with emotions, deep emotions, is to transmute. We often associate those dark emotions or difficult emotions with being negative. Be that right or wrong, let's go with that for now. So we need to transmute those negative energies, and the way we do that is we cultivate awareness. That's the key. Awareness presupposes that we're willing to look at something. Secondly, we transcend when we begin to transmute the negative energies, which, as I said before, are a signal. What is underneath emotions is a belief, and that belief is what drives the reaction. So we transmute the negative energies, which is the surface, and then we transcend, beg your pardon, the self-limiting beliefs that sit underneath it. But we've got to go through that process sometimes of digging to find that self-limiting belief. But the way we deal with those self-limiting beliefs is that we go through a process of reframing or mental gymnastics. In simple terms, we tell ourselves another story. You see, we've made something mean something, often in childhood, often in reaction, blind reaction to something. And we told ourselves a story. Oh, it means this. Oh, it means that. So reframing is simply recognizing that moment and reframing that whole situation and telling yourself a different story, i.e., what I call mental gymnastics. So we transmute the negative energies by cultivating awareness, and then we can transcend the underlying beliefs that are attached to those negative emotions by reframing the experience or the catalyst or the source of that problem. Finally, we can transform situations and scenarios, but only through action. And I put a little note here, not paralysis by analysis. See, often we can get stuck, but the key thing with the Plutonic pathway, transmute, transcend, transform, is we have to act on what it is that we've come to be aware of. That expression, fake it till you make it. Rome wasn't built in a day, but a journey of 1,000 steps begins with a 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We have to move forward. We can't just dwell in the analysis. See, these negative energies or strong emotions that we're talking about here, they physiologically can come through the pathway of the amygdala. And that is what we typically call that fight-flight response. And that is tied back to conditioning, to habits and patterns of behavior that have at some point become ineffective. They limit us. When we are in that situation of we always have the same consistent fight or flight response and we realize that it isn't actually working for us anymore, we're stuck in a rut. And that again is part of the awareness. That would be the process of transmuting the negative energies, because recognizing that you're stuck in a rut would be the first step of the Plutonic pathway. When we are stuck in a rut or a routine and we want to change something in our life, then you and I have used this expression as well. If you want to change something in your life, change something in your life. And it could be as small as, if you get up at 7 o'clock every morning to an alarm, try getting up at 6:45. If you dwell in bed in the morning and you want to change a habit, get out of bed quickly. There's all sorts of things that we can do. If you drive the same way to work every day, try and vary it. You see, that's the process of reactivating different neural pathways. This is all about transmuting those negative experiences. So there's a cognitive element to the emotions here, and there's a spiritual process as well. And we train ourselves to be still, to our minds to be still, to be quiet, to rest our mental machinery. And we do that through the process of meditation and mindfulness practice. The key word being practice. Of course, practice means repetition. There's an expression, the mother of all learning, or repetition is the mother of all learning. Now, meditation and mindfulness is deeply individual, and there are many modalities, and we've touched on them before, but you have to have some kind of practice in order to sometimes wrestle with our emotional and cognitive reactions to situations where we are stuck in a rut or we're in a routine or pattern set of behavior that is no longer serving us or is no longer effective at helping us to move forward.
That's right. Thank you so much for bringing us different perspectives on these beautiful archetypes. I love broadening my horizon as well. And I think that's another one that's really important is to have is your cup full or half full. And that expression has all to do with are you willing to be open for new things, i.e., is your cup half full? Can more things come in? Or is your cup filled to the brim and you know best and you're right and the other person is wrong? So there's some beautiful messages in this podcast so far. Write some down and see how you can apply different things in your life, or share with us what you do, and it could be something that we could apply in ours. So, how would you like to summarize this busyness that we spoke about today?
Emotions can help or hinder us, and they can instinctively, emotions are about our instinctive reactions to pleasure and pain. The seat of our emotions, the physiological response to fight or flight, is based on memory. Those memories can be deconstructed and rewritten with consciousness. Our emotions therefore need to be mastered for us to be most effective in our relationships. And the feedback, the emotions provide a feedback mechanism that provides a signal to us about our environment and how we are resonating with it, or if we are in dissonance with our environment. Are we in sync with our surroundings, or are we like a fish out of water? Saturn is about training our emotional intelligence and developing that consciously, developing resilience and self control. Emotions can teach us how to relate to others in a way that is the most effective. Emotions invoke and involve feelings and thoughts and thoughts. So they are two sides of the one coin. People separate those two faculties, but the brain and the heart, or the left and the right, but they're not. They can't be separated because they're two sides of the coin. It's the old story of the chicken and the egg, right? Which came first? Vedics talk about the manas, the manas, which is the memories that can be in two dimensionals, two planes. They can be in our physical mind body, and that's where things like acupuncture, acupressure, tapping can work because we trigger those emotions and we release them and bring them to the surface. But they can also, the manas, their memory, can also be metaphysical. That is, it operates in planes and dimensions that are quantum in nature. Our memory is what underpins our emotion, and our beliefs are what underpin our emotions. So memories and beliefs often are linked. And finally, we talked about that Plutonic pathway, which is we transform negative emotions by cultivating awareness. We transcend self-limiting beliefs through reframing and mental gymnastics. And we transform any situation or scenario we're in through action rather than analysis.
Yes, thank you. And it's the fieriness or Vulcanist can help us with that too. So if this was interesting to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We love talking with people about this very subject. I still get quite sad when people come to me, oh no, but the sun is in, I think it's supposed to go into, gosh, I don't even know, Leo probably, but we've only just going into Cancer now. So there's the true position of the planetary bodies, and that's what we use to generate these charts. So if you would like to know what your message was at the time of your birth, hit us up for a chart or a natal reading. Watch all our videos on YouTube or listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcast and Audible, apparently. David, any parting messages?
That's all from me today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ngā mihi. Until ne
Namaste.
until next time.